Greetings, boys and babes. It's the Magic Hour, a place where we navigate through life's peaks and valleys with all the vulnerability and shamelessness we can muster. With the help of world-class guests from all walks of life, we uncover new truths and valuable tools for manifesting our highest potential. I'm your host, Mercedes Terrell, along with my partner in shine, Jade Bryce.
Hi, you guys. Today we are having someone on that was one of our very first guests, and we loved him so much that we have had him on every year since. The work that he does has been nothing short of transformative in our lives. Since I first met him, I was drawn to how his presence alone is healing medicine. He has a way of making people feel seen, heard, and held, and that's what people are looking for. That's healing. After sharing with him some of my darkest and most vulnerable truths, I can still say the same while adding that he has a way of also helping remove the shame in the most graceful and empathetic way. When I was being called to heal some deep trauma from my early years of life, my soul said his name. And after sitting with him while processing that trauma, it is so obvious why my soul said his name. He is so incredible at trauma work, and his understanding of the psyche is mind-blowing. I will truly never be the same after that session. But outside of that, his posts, podcasts, and weekly blogs add so much growth and magic to my life. And by just knowing that this king exists, it inspires me and makes me feel more able to step fully into my queen.
Yes, there's a reason why we call him our podcast husband, guys. Speaking
we
of
have
which,
on other episodes.
We literally. By the way, I don't think I've ever known a man who more women come to me about saying that he's their brain crush, I guess we're going to put that in quotes, than today's guest, who you can hear laughing in the background already. He knows all this. So guys, if you're listening to this, please take notes today on what women are actually looking for, which is a man who has done his shadow work, integrated his demons, and embodied his inner king. I have been on his podcast a couple times. Jade's been on his podcast a couple times. And I think in both of our cases, we both felt more held and nurtured than in any conversation we've had elsewhere. I know I can say that for myself, at least. So if you can't already tell, I truly believe in the work this guy's doing and the teaching he is relating. It is such a gift to sit at his feet. This guy's magic is profound and palpable. Jade, what more can I say? Let's get on.
I like that you said brain crush. And while I have been called a sapiosexual by many people, it is a person's transparent truth that is flowing from a heart-centered soul that I think is overwhelmingly attractive. So those people may think that they have a brain crush and are a sapiosexual, but I like to call it cardiosexual.
So that's a workout. Yeah.
But yeah, workout. But yes, let's get them on the show. Our guest today is a podcaster, Jungian enthusiast, storyteller, myth weaver, dream interpreter extraordinaire, student of plant medicine, healer, and medicine man himself, longtime supporter of our show and one of our greatest teachers. Using cognitive, evolutionary, and Jungian psychology, he helps people discover, articulate, and change the stories that rule their lives. He is a way shower and trailblazer in what it means to be human, and we genuinely believe that this guy is doing work that will be a part of history forever and is changing the landscape of psychotherapy. He reminds us that it's our work to do what we can to remember the soul, to remember the love that's at the heart of how and why we heal. Please help me welcome our favorite magician and love warrior king to the Magic Hour.
Yeah.
Wow, no pressure. Let's see if I can live up to that. Wow, thank you two so much.
We're so grateful for you being here. So we have a ton to dive in with on how we want to say that? Dive in with you today. Anyway, all the things.
And we've got scuba gear on.
Yeah, we've got our scuba gear on. Something that you have been really going deep on, especially this year, it seems, with all the book recos that I've been seeing flying through the social medias, is studying trauma and mental health. You've always been, a psychonaut and into psychology of all the types, but what is it specifically that initially called you to do this deep dive into trauma and mental health studies?
Yeah, so this past year, Aubrey asked me to be the research writer for his book, and his book is all about mental health. And it was a interesting full circle because after I graduated, I got a degree in cognitive psychology, a bachelor's, and I spent like 2 years debating about whether or not I wanted to go get a PhD in clinical psychology. And then I read a book called Sapiens that essentially laid out that to go get a PhD, you essentially become beholden to getting research grants from either the government or from large companies. And once I realized that I would be kind of, a servant to where I could get the money, I was like, you know what, I'm going to go learn how to run a company, create a company that provides me my own revenue. And so I could do my own research. And once I started working with Aubrey at On It, once he started to write the book, he asked me to be the research writer. And once I started doing that research, I realized, oh, this is me getting to write my PhD dissertation. But instead of paying a university $100,000 to get to write it, I'm actually being paid to write it. And so it was like this really amazing opportunity. And the first chapter was supposed to be on depression. And depression has been one of the things that I've been the most interested in studying. But this was the first time that I actually went and researched it like a researcher. And I very quickly found some pretty shocking facts, which is the chemical imbalance theory of depression is a lie. There is, and I could get into it, but I know that we have a lot of questions. But once I found that, and then I started looking at the evidence of the effectiveness of placebo drugs when compared to antidepressant drugs, I went down this rabbit hole, looked into some researchers, and this whole landscape blossomed of the documented historical corruption by pharmaceutical companies, of the American Psychiatric Association, and of our government to sell us this story that was not backed by science. And there's a book called The Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker that has over 800 citations that just lays it all out in a way that completely transformed my understanding of our current attempt to heal mental illness, primarily through pharmacology, and how it's not working. And that was a huge thing that happened for me probably around April. And I know that it's something that I will be talking about for the rest of my life. And why it's so important is it is the current attempt that our culture is doing to heal mental illness, and it's not working. And then one of the chapters that I started to work on was about addiction. And once I started going down the rabbit hole of addiction, it became very clear that the people who are experts on this all agree that the root of addiction is trauma. And I'd never done any formal research on trauma. So I basically bought all the best books that I could find. Most of them are by Peter Levine. And I started going deep on trauma. And what I realized was trauma seems to be one of the core actual roots of the mental health epidemic in our culture. Because the pharmacological model, it says that the reason, like that the source of mental illness is essentially a chemical imbalance. It's your genes. It's more nuanced than that, but the way it's sold to the average person in the public, if you asked 100 people what causes depression, 99 people are going to say a chemical imbalance, and you might find one person who might say something like God or something. And then once I started to really get into trauma, the thing that really blossomed for me was all of the research in the different areas of my life for the last 10 years that I've been most attracted to. All of it was a part of understanding trauma. And I just felt super called to write what is now the longest thing that I've ever written, a blog post called What is Trauma? And I worked on it for like 2.5 months, and then I turned it into a podcast. And it is the thing that I have done that has gotten the most feedback of anything that I've done so far. And it revolutionized my understanding of the psyche. So like my big dream is to essentially create a new type of healing system that is more effective than all of the conventional models that we have for healing mental disorders. And I thought that the way that you did that before I did the research on trauma was all about people's stories and like helping people change. Right. And that's why my podcast is called The Myths That Make Us. And I'm obsessed with stories. And I thought it could all be done in the mind. But what I learned about trauma is that we essentially have two parts of us. There's the storyteller, but then there's the animal. And if the animal is traumatized, it almost imprisons the storyteller to tell fearful, constrictive stories. And no matter how much work you do on someone's storytelling, if their animal is still in a state of fight or flight all the time, it's going to be probably impossible, but at best, extremely difficult to heal people's stories. And so doing the research on trauma has actually, it showed me that I was wrong. For the last 10 years, I've been wrong. And that it starts with helping the animal heal. And then once the animal can get to a place of peace, it's much easier to help people upgrade their stories.
Yeah. I know we're going to get into what healing looks like and how we do that during this podcast, but in your blog, you talk about the polar bear, and you talk about is it a gazelle?
Mm-hmm.
Or impala.
Or impala, yeah. These animals that we can literally see on YouTube, shaking out the trauma. What is that response mechanism? Like, what's happening there? Because you're talking about like the somatic healing work, right? What does that look like? I guess is what I want to know first.
So those videos, I think, are some of the most important videos that anyone who has the symptoms of trauma could possibly watch, because it shows you how animals intuitively know how to process trauma. And one of the things that's really important to understand about trauma is that we have a body that has evolved over millions of years to react to specific stimuluses in the environment in a adaptive way that has been honed by evolution, and that those instincts you don't have conscious control of. And we'll get into it, but one of the reasons why humans become traumatized is their storytelling about how they responded in the traumatic situation. And they think that it makes them weak, or that they somehow are like, that there's shame or guilt around how they've responded. And one of the things that's really important for people to understand is these instincts are not your fault if you've acted this way. But so to kind of set the stage, in our evolutionary history, we were both prey animals and predator animals, and we have a set of instincts for dealing with danger that both predators and prey animals have. And the first way that we've evolved to react to danger is the fight or flight response. And everyone's familiar with the fight or flight response. And you either think that you can run and escape it, or you think that you can fight it. But prey animals have an extra instinct, and it's the freeze response. And it's the freeze response that tends to be the reaction that most people will have in the face of trauma, that then leads to them having traumatic symptoms. And the video of the impala is super important to watch for people who think that they have trauma, because what happens is a lion catches the impala and has it by the neck. And the freeze response is the last ditch effort of the organism to attempt to survive when there's no other option. And so this powerful instinct seizes the body and paralyzes the animal, and the animal looks dead. And there are evolutionary adaptive reasons why this would happen. And some of them would be predators require movement in order for their attack and eat response to be triggered. And so if you're paralyzed, if you appear dead, you don't trigger that instinct in the predator. The other one is, if predators aren't super hungry, they won't eat dead meat, because dead meat from an evolutionary standpoint will tend to be bad meat or like sick meat. And so if they freeze themselves, they're less likely to be eaten. But the most important one is the freeze response numbs the prey animal. It reduces the pain that it experiences if it's fucking being eaten alive. And one of the symptoms of that freeze response is disassociation. And that's one of the major symptoms of people who have incurred trauma, is they will disassociate from their body, or they'll disassociate from their memories. And that's why you can have repressed memories. But what animals do intuitively, what the impala does intuitively, is that if the predator either gets chased off by somebody else or just loses its focus and like wanders away, the impala will bolt up and run to safety. And as soon as it's safe, it will start to seize. And the seizuring is the muscles like excreting out the instinctual impulse to look like they have rigor mortis. And humans, because of our storytelling ability and our ability to repress what we feel, most people who go through a traumatic experience don't do that last part. And that last part is what tells the organism you're no longer in danger. And so if you don't do that, a part of your animal body will live every day as if the predator is still in your environment. And so you have this chronic stress response that destroys your sleep. Your sleep is where you do most of your rebuilding of your body. And over the course of weeks and months and years, if that's never processed clearly or fully, it destroys your health. And there's this whole symptom, or a whole spread of symptoms, that to Western doctors who haven't studied trauma, it seems like 8 or 10 different things are wrong with you. And they'll give you 4 to 5 different medications to deal with all these things. But if you process the trauma held in the body, what researchers like Peter Levine have found is all of these symptoms go away, because they're all the result of a chronic stress response that is destroying the immune system over the course of months or years.
Yeah. So when we're looking at, sorry, Jade, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something real quick about the freeze response. I know that with my sexual trauma, the mother of the person who did the sexual trauma or did the sexual act to me, her first response was, well, why didn't you walk away? Why didn't you stop him? And I was only like 12, 13 when I was asked that. So I remember up until just here recently, when I read Mary Magdalene Revealed, and then when I did work with Erick, feeling shame for my freeze response. I felt like I didn't fight back. And now I feel thankful for my freeze response. I feel thankful to my body for using that survival tactics, because that was how it fought back. And that was how I survived. So now that shame is now gratitude. So if anyone's listening and that freeze response felt familiar to them, I wanted to offer that perspective.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important aspects for people who have gone through traumatic experiences, is if you understand that this is an instinct that has been programmed into you by the intelligence of evolution, because it's been honed in the environments that we've evolved from for millions of years, you didn't do anything wrong. A force that is akin to a god, which I would say are what instincts are, gripped you and did the best it could, and you are not at fault. And one of the things that traps trauma in the body is this felt sense of shame. And so helping people let go of their shame is one of the most important parts of why I feel so inspired to teach this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that leads us to the idea of PTSD and what is happening in our psyche when that's coming up, what's happening in our body when that's coming up for us or is trying to play out.
And what exactly is PTSD? Because a lot of people hear PTSD, not so much now, but a lot of people hear PTSD and think of war veterans.
Right.
So
in doing the research on trauma, what I have found is, so PTSD is a specific type of trauma, and it's what's technically called shock trauma. And shock trauma like the most common ways that it happens are war, sexual assaults, and surgery. And this is something that most people don't know, but one of the most common ways people accrue PTSD is actually to go and get surgery. And what causes PTSD, which is called shock trauma, is essentially either the fight or flight response is biologically or physically inhibited. So like if you're held down or if you're drugged, and then, or if you chose the freeze response, but you didn't ever clear the energy out completely. And this is shock trauma. But there's also a thing called developmental trauma. And this is something that has not been, or maybe within the last year has started to become officially recognized as an actual type of trauma, but all the experts on trauma agree this is absolutely a different type of trauma. And developmental trauma is essentially, there's a couple of ways to come at it, but I think the best way to understand it is at any point in your developmental life, and it will almost always be in the presence of caretakers. If you felt any genuine call to express and you didn't, either because you were shamed or you were taught that you weren't supposed to, or you were physically stopped, you start to accrue almost like emotional gunk in your body. So for men, anytime that you felt the urge to cry growing up, if you were taught that it wasn't acceptable to cry, every time that you felt the urge, you can almost imagine like there's a well in your body of how much stress your body can hold before it starts to cause damage. And every time that you had the urge to cry and you didn't, some water gets added to that well. And for women, the most common one when I talk to therapists that work in this field is anytime that you felt the urge to express anger or to maintain boundaries and you don't, there's this slow accretion of water in this well. And we all, on some level, have developmental trauma. Like, I haven't met anyone who is fully uninhibited in their expression of their genuine emotions.
I've met people that say they aren't.
Right.
Okay.
And then in doing the research, in conjunction with everything that I've done for the last 10 years, I propose that there's a third type, and I would call it like storyteller trauma. And it's where something happens in your life where the truth of it is so disruptive to the story of who you believe you are that your entire story of who you are breaks. And the most common example is if you're married for 10 years and you come home one day and your spouse has left you and they left a note saying that they've been cheating on you with somebody else for 6 years and that they're divorcing you, that piece of truth, it doesn't cause shock trauma and it's not the result of developmental trauma, but it destroys people. And the result of it will often either be depression or mania or psychosis if they can't integrate the truth into restructuring who they believe that they are. And so I think that that's a third type, but there's no one that I know who is making the claim for that being a type of trauma. But I think that's one of the roots of depression. But to get back to the original question, PTSD is shock trauma. And that's when one of those primary instincts, fight, flight, or freeze, is inhibited and you're not able to discharge or complete the act. And that causes PTSD.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And so, I mean, I guess that's kind of categorizing PTSD as something that most people are dealing with to some regard or another, or to some level or another. Is that what you notice?
So PTSD seems to be less common than developmental trauma. PTSD, most people know if they've incurred PTSD because there was some significant event like a car accident or a rape or you went to war and there was some really powerful experience that happened where you weren't able to complete the act. And we can get into like how the symptoms play out, but what's super interesting is one of the things that's really important to understand about trauma is that no wild animals hold on to trauma. It's only humans and domesticated animals. And there's some specific examples about why that happens. But what that shows is that to incur trauma is natural for an organism that is complex in its structure enough to be a social animal, and that it's also natural to heal it. There is an innate healing intelligence inside of us that if we don't get in the way of, knows exactly what to do to heal this. And the video of the polar bear is the perfect fucking example. So to give people that story, there's a video in the blog article that I wrote that Peter Levine uses as a teaching tool. And he's regarded as one of the greatest experts on healing trauma that is alive right now. And these biologists are in a helicopter and they have to dart this polar bear to tag it for some science. And they're in a helicopter and the polar bear is running. And they eventually hit it with a dart that tranquilizes it. And then they tag it and they do everything that they need to do. And as the polar bear is coming out of the tranquilization, the first thing that happens is it starts taking these huge, deep breaths while it's still unconscious. And as it takes these huge, deep breaths, after a couple of these breaths, it starts convulsing. It looks like it's having a seizure. And the biologist is explaining this is completely normal. This is actually a part of him healing what just happened to him. And Peter Levine breaks this down, and this is one of the really interesting insights. It's not random convulsions. They're actually micro movements of what the polar bear needed to do in the moment when it was tranquilized in order to escape. And so it's small twitches of its paws and its legs to represent the running. And so, like, what people will experience as they start, if they get to a place where their body feels safe enough to process trauma, is whatever the shaking is, it tends to be the symbolic acts that the animal needed to do in the moment of trauma. One of the stories that Peter Levine talks about, and this is such a crazy story, but you know, he studied trauma for like 30 years. And then when he was an older man, he was riding his bike one day and he got hit by a car. And all of the knowledge that he has accrued about how to heal trauma was like watching his meat suit go through what happened. Mm-hmm. So he gets hit by a car. He's lying in the middle of the road. He can't move. He's in shock. And people start to crowd around. And this man comes up to him. And the man is really abrasive. He thinks he's trying to help, but he's just super abrasive. And Peter Levine can feel like the force of this man is actually making him not feel safe. And he starts to get angry and agitated, but he's not able to move because he's still in shock. And eventually a woman comes up and kind of quiet down the man and puts her hand on Levine and just kind of like holds space and doesn't try to do anything, but just kind of emanates this like, I am with your suffering. I see you. The ambulance is coming, and isn't trying to do anything. And Peter Levine could feel that that was healing. Mm. The ambulance eventually comes, and like it's tragic to feel into, but what the ambulance or what the first responders do is they strap him down to a bed and they put him in the ambulance. And Peter Levine can see, oh, this is going to trap the trauma in my body. And so he actually starts to talk to the first responders and explains who he is and what his research is and convinces them to unstrap him. And then he starts to do like this body check-in where he basically gives his body permission to do whatever it wants. And his right shoulder starts to twitch and his arm starts to come up towards his face. And his body is symbolically doing what it should have done to protect himself from the car, but that he didn't have time to do. And he was able to let his body complete the symbolic act of protecting itself. And then by the time he got to the hospital, he could feel that he had let the trauma go and he didn't incur traumatic symptoms. But this is an example of like the way our medical system is set up, because they don't understand trauma, it actually can trap trauma in the body. And then people later will have to do the work to get into a safe space where they allow their body to essentially seize.
So you're saying that animals don't have the same effect necessarily. They don't store trauma in the body the same way if they're able to shake it out or whatever they need to do in order to move it through their body.
Right. Wild animals don't become traumatized, but they experience trauma and then they release it.
So what about like I have a cat that was feral when, I got him, and he definitely is a lot different than my other cat that's very social and all that. And he's constantly kind of twitchy and hypersensitive and seems like he's traumatized if you look at it from a human sense. And he, if he hears any voices coming towards the house he doesn't know, you'll never find him for like a day, you know what I mean? So there's some sort of, now is that like because he was a feral cat, is that maybe a genetically stored trauma in a sense? Or what do you...
When I bring this up, I've gotten questions like this from people who have dogs or have cats that they feel are traumatized. And the way that I understand it is they technically do not have PTSD in the sense that they have a chronic stress response that when they feel safe, they act like that when they are not in the presence of a trigger, that they're just at baseline, that they're not at a heightened state of stress in the same way that a human can be in a room where there is no trigger of a threat, but if they're traumatized, they will still feel like they are stressed out.
Mm-hmm.
But what animals that have been through traumatic experience will do is they learn. And so in the presence of a trigger, like a car horn or people talking,
Mm-hmm.
they have a set of reflexes that are more extreme than a domesticated cat that's protective. But once they get wherever they need to get, where they feel safe, they return completely to baseline.
Mm.
There's a book by Robert Sapolsky, and he's a famous biologist, and it's called Zebra or Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Mm.
And the whole idea is that they don't hold a chronic stress response when they are not in the immediate environment of a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And so your feral cat has a more intense set of reflexes in the presence of triggers that remind it of threats that it's been exposed to in the past. But when it goes and finds its safe place in some corner of under a bed in one of your
Mm-hmm.
rooms, it goes back to baseline and it's not in a chronic stress response.
Got it. So I think we touched on this a bit, but the 4 symptoms of response or responses to trauma, maybe you can just delineate those again and see if we take off on one of those again.
So the symptoms of trauma is one of the most interesting parts of all this, because it shows us, at least to me, how we are holistic beings and the mind and the body are not as separate as we believe that they are. But the 4 primary symptoms of trauma, and Peter Levine calls these the core 4, they are perfectly adaptive in the immediate moment of the threat. But if they continue in the absence of the threat, you will begin to get a whole host of symptoms that will get progressively worse as time goes on, because your chronic stress response will continue to degrade your physical health. But the core 4, the first one is hypervigilance.
Mm-hmm.
And hypervigilance is essentially what we've evolved to be like when we perceive threat in our environment. And the hallmark of this are the wide eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Like lots of women that I know who, like, one of the ways that you can feel into whether or not someone has unprocessed trauma is if their eyes always look like they're on edge or they're surprised, because their nervous system is priming their body to detect threat. And so hypervigilance is essentially the body mobilizing its tools to anticipate a threat. The second one is constriction. You have biological and psychological constriction in the presence of a threat. And so your eyes will dilate, your breathing will constrict, your blood vessels will actually constrict, your muscles will constrict, and a lot of people will have chronic muscular pain as one of the symptoms of trauma, because there's this chronic constriction because you're anticipating having to run or fight. And so there's this constriction. The third one is disassociation. And this is one of the most complex and interesting ones, but you will disassociate from being fully connected to your body because you're anticipating pain. And there's this part of you that thinks that it's actually protecting you from pain. But chronic disassociation can lead to repressed memories. It can lead to blackouts. It can lead to you not being connected to your body, so you're prone to injuries. There might be aspects of your body that feel completely unconscious to you. And if that goes on for a long time, it can cause a lot of issues. And the fourth one is a felt sense of helplessness. And this is probably the most detrimental one. But many people who have gone through trauma, their felt sense of agency in the world, the belief that their actions can actually improve their life, is destroyed. And agency is one of the fundamental psychological traits that one needs to be resilient to stress and to also thrive. And so one of the really important things in healing trauma is to help people reclaim agency. And there's a couple of stories that I can share when we start to talk about how you heal trauma that will represent that clearly. But those are the core four. And if those continue beyond the immediate exposure to threat, they lead to a chronic elevated stress response that leads to a chronic elevation of inflammation, which tends to be the bedrock of what causes a lot of the chronic mental and biological diseases, quote unquote, that we see in Western culture.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. It brings up for me a question about, I don't even know if it's a question, but the hypervigilance piece for me, I think, and maybe you tell me if I'm mistaken here, but I get like super hearing sense. And I think that comes from my childhood, where I would literally listen at my door to see when my stepmom would not be in the kitchen, so that I could like go out there and get food or cross over to get to my car or whatever I was doing, that I was trying to avoid confrontation with her. And that hyper vigilance, I think, in an interesting way, translated into a fetish for me, which I think most fetishes, well, all fetishes, I think, come from needing to heal things in our psyche. So for me, it turned into this like being hypersensitive to the voice of my lover. So like hearing my lover's voice, or hearing him talk, or even just breathing, or any of those sounds that you could hear, especially in a really intimate setting, are like a fetish for me. You know what I mean? I think that's a really normal fetish for a lot of people, but I have other non-normal fetishes. Okay, guys, I'm just a freak. No, I'm just kidding. But so that for me is interesting. And I just thought maybe you have some words for how we sometimes translate trauma or something that comes up, in our young childhood into fetish. And then how because we're going to go into this healing work. I think next is our questioning is going to go that way. So maybe that can help us enter in there. Yeah.
So that's a great insight. And there's a few things that come up when I hear. The first thing is, it's actually more common to experience what's called post-traumatic growth than to have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's something like 80% of people who go through a traumatic situation, once they've done the work, will report it as one of the most like useful things that have happened to them, because it helped them create or become some new thing. And most people who go through trauma, they actually incur superpowers if they can liberate themselves from the trauma of whatever the adaptive actions were that they had to learn in the response to the traumatic experience when they were younger. Like a lot of people who would call themselves empaths, very likely, and there have been psychological studies on this that have shown this to be true, that if you had a parent who was emotionally volatile as a child, to protect yourself, you had to learn how to anticipate their emotional state before they even spoke. And probably all three of us here have this deeper sense of intuition into other people's emotional states, because we had an emotional volatile parent. And while that is traumatic on one level, it also causes us to adapt in a way that makes us more capable growing up. So that's one thing to articulate, is that trauma can actually be the quote that I really like is, our traumas are the wounds that become the wounds that birth our medicine. And that's kind of a poetic way to look at, like, if you do the work, the trauma that you incurred actually produces superpowers. So that's one thing. Another is, I don't know if I'm ready to claim that I believe that all fetishes are the result of trauma, but the people that I've studied, and a lot of really smart people, they actually do believe that is the case. And the really interesting thing about a fetish is that it allows you to claim agency. It allows you to consciously enter into reenacting the traumatic experience in a way where you get control over it. And that is actually one of the ways that you heal trauma. And so a part of what this has unfolded in me is like, what BDSM and what like that entire community allows is it creates a really clear container where you talk about what you are comfortable with before. There's a clear delineation between talking about it and then entering into the scene. And it gives you the opportunity, if you want to go back into the traumatic experience that happened in the past, but you now have a safe word, and you also get to choose how it unfolds. And there can be a lot of trauma healing that can happen within that container. I don't think that our medical model or our society is advanced enough to let that ever be, in the next 100 years, a healing modality that's actually done, because the amount of training that it would take for the therapist to hold that container is beyond what we seem to be able to create in people. But people can play it out in their personal romantic lives, and it actually is a very powerful way to do healing.
Yeah.
We actually
go deeper into that with River Warring.
Yeah,
River Warring. I have a hard time with that.
River Roaring. It is a word. It's really tough to say.
It sounds like a porn name.
It's not a real name, but
she's a
sexual
sex worker.
Surrogate.
Yeah,
she's a sexual surrogate that actually works as a therapist to help people venture through
really cool.
their fetishes.
Yeah, our episode with her, we go pretty deep into that. So,
yeah, intended, I guess. Right.
Well, let's talk about the tools to heal the trauma. And maybe you can share with us some of the things that you've seen while you sat for others while they healed some trauma. And I'm completely comfortable with you talking about our experience of what you observed as I processed my trauma, if that's helpful, because there's nothing I wouldn't share with our audience, especially if it would aid in their own healing. So, let's get into that.
Yeah. So, because there's 3 different types of trauma, what I'm going to focus on is the one where the most research has been done that allows for the healing, and that's PTSD. That's shock trauma. But what helps people heal shock trauma will very likely help people also integrate storytelling trauma and then developmental trauma. But developmental trauma is notoriously harder to heal because the trauma likely happened with caretakers, and that creates a whole warping of how you relate to people, how you trust people, and that's fundamentally harder to heal. But we can get into that, but I'll start with shock trauma. So shock trauma is essentially healed through cultivating awareness, reclaiming agency, and then, potentially, if you feel ready, to share your story. And so what that looks like is Peter Levine has made famous this term called the felt sense. And the felt sense is to teach people how to non-judgmentally feel what is in their body. What's really interesting is if you ask someone how they feel, like we did it at the very beginning of this podcast, people intuitively say a judgment as opposed to articulating what they are actually feeling. And so if you say you feel good or bad, that's not the felt sense. That's the mind judging a configuration of body sensations. And most people don't even have access to the raw body sensations that's happening in their body. Like if someone says that they're angry is a label for a body sensation. And anger might manifest differently in all 3 of us. Like anger might be heat in the head, or a constriction in the chest, or a constriction in the throat, or like a throbbing in your gut. And how anger feels to you is actually a portal into whether or not you might have stored trauma there. And so Peter Levine has a whole bunch of techniques that you can go find in his very short book called Healing Trauma to teach people how to cultivate the felt sense. But the practice that he offers that I find is the easiest bridge for people is he has a meditative practice where you take a shower.
That's my magic trick today.
Let's go.
Go ahead.
Where you turn it slightly above warm, and then you direct the stream onto each part of your body, and you can start at your feet, and you just feel the pulsing of the hot water on your right foot, and you say, "This is my right foot. I welcome you home." And you feel what it feels like to have sensations in your right foot. And then you move up to your shin, and then your knee, and then your thigh, and your left foot, and et cetera, et cetera. And you, almost all of us, have some trauma stored in us. And you will get to a part of your body that you can't feel. And you just keep it there. Like it might be your pelvis, it might be your right butt cheek, it might be your right shoulder. Like I got surgery on my right shoulder and there's inhibited sensation there. And you can do this also through meditation, like any type of meditation that helps you bring awareness to each part of your body and invites you to like allow it to relax more and more. That starts to cultivate this feeling of the felt sense. And then what will happen is, if you feel something somewhere, and what somatic experiencing therapists do, and this is the type of therapy that Peter Levine created, they're super good at reading someone's body, and they can see where there's some type of like lockness happening. And then they will ask the person to do some, what might seem like a random movement. Like one of the most common ones they do is, a lot of us will clench our jaw when we are repressing wanting to feel something. So one of the things that a lot of somatic experiencers will do is they'll tell the patient, slowly open and close your jaw and say, ah. And so you just go, ah. And if you're in that space where they feel safe, that will make people start to cry almost always, because it tricks the biology where you can't constrict your jaw anymore. And if you can't constrict your jaw, it reduces your ability to repress the emotion, and then something will start to come up. And then what he teaches with the felt sense is, can you non-judgmentally just hold your awareness on whatever is happening in your body? And then once you do that, can you ask it, what do you want to tell me? Or what are you here to teach me? Or what do you want to do next? And then when you're in the presence of a really experienced worker here, and I'm an amateur at this, but like it's something that I want to cultivate my understanding in, is that an experience will happen in the body that will eventually lead to some type of tremoring, some type of somatic release that afterwards will actually give you a deeper felt sense of integration in your body. And sometimes, but not all of the time, memories will start to come back as this part of the body starts to come alive. And what's interesting is that the memories that can come up in this experience are not always what actually happened. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about trauma and repressed memories. And Peter Levine has a whole book called Trauma and Memory, where he really tries to drive this home. You will sometimes have visions that are actually symbolic representations akin to dreams or visions on plant medicine that represents the energy that is being healed and is not an actual memory of what happened. And as the memory comes up, it's the body almost trying to symbolically give you an opportunity to act in the vision that's coming up in a symbolic way that can heal you. And I'll give a story to really cement this. Peter Levine has this famous story where he was doing this research on trauma, and he had someone come into his office who had had panic attacks for like 20 years. And she had gone to dozens of doctors, have taken all sorts of meds, but they couldn't get rid of these panic attacks. And the panic attacks were so bad that she couldn't leave the house. So when she came into Peter's office, he put her through some relaxation techniques to like help her let her guard down. And what he saw was her heart rate dropped almost to the point of her like passing out. And he was getting really worried. And behind him, because he had been studying animals in order to understand trauma, he had a vision of there was a stalking tiger in the room. And he just intuitively yelled at her, "A tiger is in the room. You need to run." And she screamed, and her legs started to tremor. And she started like, her legs were doing the symbolic action of running. And she's screaming. And it was such a loud commotion that a police officer was outside in the office and came into the room and was like, "What the fuck is going on?" And Peter Levine's assistant was able to kind of explain to the cop what was happening. And this was like 20 years ago. So the fact that his assistant was able to explain what the fuck was going on to not interrupt it is a miracle.
Yeah.
But he started to coach her through this running. And then he was like, "There's a tree, run up in the tree and get away from the tiger." And she crawled up this tree and her arm started to seize. And then she reclaimed a memory. And she remembered that when she was 4 or 6, she got a tonsillectomy. And she could remember that she was terrified as she was being given the ether. And she wanted to run, but she couldn't complete the action because she got sedated. And so that running that needing to run had been trapped in her body. And so she was hyper vigilant. And so all sorts of things would trigger this need to run, but she didn't understand what she needed to do. And after that first meeting with Levine, she basically screamed and shook for an hour. She never had a panic attack again.
Wow.
And she came back for a couple more sessions. He put her through a couple of more experiences where she had more tremoring, to the point where she was able to go get a PhD, and she was able to get off most of the meds that she was on.
Wow.
And that's an example of, she reclaimed agency through a vision. She never in her life was actually chased by a tiger, but the vision of the tiger allowed her to symbolically act out what needed to be done in the presence of the actual trauma that healed her. And one of the things that is most misunderstood is people will think that anything that arises in their psyche is an actual memory. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And Peter Levine's big takeaway here is, it doesn't matter. If you can't know for sure whether or not it happened, it's not important about whether or not it's real. It's what is the symbolic or physical act that needs to be done, that the vision is trying to prompt you to do, that will help you reclaim agency. And so the first part is cultivating awareness. And that is fundamentally learning how to do this felt sense technique. And then number two is to reclaim agency. And reclaiming agency is you either symbolically or physically act out what needed to be done in that moment. And that is almost always intuitively taken care of by how the tremoring happens. And then the third one is, can you articulate the story to yourself in a way where you can integrate gratitude and meaning from it? Like Jade mentioned that at the beginning of the podcast, that she was able to cultivate gratitude for how she had acted. And the ultimate last stage of this healing is, if you feel comfortable, can you share it with people that you care about? Because there's a bunch of research that shows if something has happened to you and you don't share it, that it feels like a secret, and that the reason it's a secret is because you either feel ashamed or guilty or afraid to share it. That actually creates a chronic stress response. A part of your psyche is always trying to protect that thing, and it eats up energy. And that if you share it, even if you articulate it only to yourself, you actually heal that chronic stress trigger. There's a researcher named James Pennebaker who has overseen over 300 studies on a type of journaling that's called expressive writing. And these are people that heal trauma by articulating the story to themselves. They don't even have to share it with other people. But if you can articulate how the story fits into the story of your life in a way that gives you a felt sense of agency or gratitude, it heals that too.
So I'm curious, I know I asked you this yesterday, but I feel like a lot of parents listening, when you talked about her being 6 and having a surgery, are wondering what they can do for their children that may have this type of trauma in their bodies. Like I mentioned yesterday, my son being circumcised, they literally strap boys down, little boys down at only a day or two old, and cut the most sensitive part of their body. So we talked about Peter Levine being strapped in the thing. We've talked about the 6-year-old girl. I'm curious what parents listening can do for their children to help process that through their bodies.
Yeah, so the first thing here, and I shared this with Jade yesterday, is for the parent not to shame themselves for the choice that they made there, because most people just don't know that this is truly traumatic. And it is. Like, our understanding of trauma is such that I cannot possibly imagine a situation where that wouldn't cause trauma. And so the first thing is to forgive yourself, because it's not like you were given this information before you made that choice, and you did what you thought was best in that moment. For your children, like, one of the best things that you can do is encourage them to do any type of activity that will help them connect to their body. And so I'm pretty sure that your son does jujitsu, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the greatest possible things that you could let your children do, is it will connect them to their body. And so like yoga, jujitsu, kickboxing, any type of sport where they're really trained in the fundamentals, it will allow them to start to feel a sense of competence in their own body, and the activity will force them to be in their own body. And once they're of an old enough age where you feel like you can start to teach them the felt sense, like this is something that you could do with them, where you could like tap on their body and you could explain, this is an exercise to help you understand your body more. And you could say, this is my foot, this is my shin, and you just tap along their body. And I think you can start there. I haven't done it, you know, I don't have children yet, and I intuitively don't know at what age you could start to consciously do trauma work, but you can do a lot of healing by helping them get into activities that allow them to connect to their body, but then also connect to a community through the shared activity. And that's why like youth sports, jujitsu, and things like that are incredibly powerful.
I'm also, go ahead.
I was just going to say something that came up for me while we were talking about Peter Levine's method, and that nothing that comes up is irrelevant, first of all, and it doesn't really matter if it's a real memory or not, whatever that means, because you really invited us to the work of Carl Jung and dream journaling, dream psychology. You were where we entered that work. And we've spent a lot of time now on this podcast talking about dreams and dream journaling with you and on your podcast, and then also just with other, you know, people we've had on the show. And that idea of dreams being this distant reference, you know, this distant analogies to what's something you need to heal in your own life or psyche, makes me think of the way that Peter Levine's relating that idea of whatever comes up. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, you're trying to intellectualize it into something. Well, is this real? Did this really happen to me? Did this event of this tiger chasing me really happen to me? That's not the focus. The focus is, what is this showing me? What comes up when I go through the motions here? I don't know if that leads you to any thoughts.
Yes, spot on. So one of the reasons why the trauma research was so invigorating for me is that the healing is the same thing that is done when you understand how to interpret dreams. And just like a really interesting side note is, one of the techniques that's used for helping people process trauma is called, it's escaping me right now, but it's where you move your eyes back and forth. EMDR. What EMDR does is it tricks the biology to go into the same psychological state that you are in when you dream. It's rapid eye movement. And what we're doing when we're dreaming, on some sense, is we are processing symbolic images that represent emotions into like our body. And on one level, that's what dreams are, is there's a part of your mind that can only speak in images. And it's speaking in images to represent energies in the body. And it creates this felt sense of disjointed imagery, but it's really processing how you move through different emotional states to essentially help heal you. And EMDR will force that in the waking state, and it helps people process trauma. And like, that's just, it's so fascinating to me that what is organically done in dreams, if biologically manipulated to happen in conscious awareness, heals. Like, it's just an insight that like dreaming is healing you. And also, and you know, I've done some dream interpretation for both of you, that you cannot hide from your dreams. And your dreams will show you, if you learn how to interpret them, where you have unprocessed shit. And it will show you like what your cycles are, how you avoid. Like, if you want to have the most intimate possible relationship with your partner, share your dreams with each other. You can't hide shit. Like, if you're entertaining text from someone that you know that you're attracted to, and it's starting to create an energetic experience inside of you, it's going to come up in your motherfucking dream. You know, if you're running from an argument with your partner because you're upset with how they did X, Y, and Z, it's going to come up in your motherfucking dreams. And to me, what that is a sign of is there is this innate healing intelligence inside of us that wants us to confront wherever we are blocked and to alchemize it. And it's true in dreams, and it's also true in this trauma work.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. And just because we're here in this circle and this setting with these people, from you and Jade, for me, you know, held this little container for me for now several years, which is pretty cool to say. And Jade knows that during quarantine, I like really decided to take construction from COVID and go inward and have a therapy session every week for the like 7 months straight. And then, and I'm still doing it, but I also dream journaled every single morning, which is a lot of dreams. And now it's funny, now I actually analyze my dreams in my dreams, which has turned into a whole weird, it's like a whole weird thing. And then I always spend the first hour, like I don't even have to journal. I journal them if I can tell they need to be journaled now, but otherwise it's like, I just spend an hour with my eyes closed basically after I wake up, and I just sort through it, you know, and I kind of get the messaging.
Amazing. That's amazing.
It's amazing. It's amazing that this healing is available for anyone at any time. But I wanted to offer something here because it's coming up for me, that when you talked about constriction in the body. You know, for me, I had so much constipation growing up, literally chronic constipation, because I was so, like I said, hypervigilant, in fear of, you know, of confrontation. I was constricted. I was always in that like ready to hide mode, basically flight mode. And you talked about that idea of where we disassociate, you know, where we leave our feelings or our felt sense behind. And I think that was definitely me as well. I left it behind in a lot of ways. But one thing I noticed through talking about dreams with you and the work we've done on this podcast and things, you know, doing my own soul searching and seeking of myself, was that the thing I could really say I had, or was it like, felt like it could be a gift or something that most people don't have, is vivid dreams. I always have had, never pushed them away, because I realized early on that they were a gift in the sense that I could experience, like I always, every ovulation, essentially, I would experience cheating on whatever boyfriend I was with at the time, and going through what that would be like and playing it all the way out, the consequence, you know, what the fun part was, then the consequence of it, was it worth it, all the detriment that happens afterward. And I could wake up and be like, okay, I don't want to do that. It made me a very loyal partner, you know? And there was a lot of other things that I didn't know at the time were coming through with those messages. And now I can sort them out. But because I realized that for me, it was dreams, but for anyone listening, it might be something else for you. But that was somewhere that I was still had a very thorough channel with myself. I had a thorough connection that was stable enough for, I could see that it's enough that I was like, okay, yeah, I dream extremely vividly, where sometimes I'm not sure what's real life and what's a dream. And we talked on another show about that being potentially schizophrenic, but anyway, so just the offering to who's listening is that wherever, maybe start wherever you already know you do feel a connection to yourself, whatever that means. And it's something that feels, oh, well, that seems a little more powerful than maybe most have, you know, like for me, the dreams were vivid enough where I knew that was something that could be a gift because it was so strong. I could feel it so strongly. And then it did bring me back, you know, this last, you know, now it's been almost a year being in COVID, of course, for everybody. But this time has been me reconnecting with myself through my dreams is what started that inception, but led to other ways I could experience felt sense and letting off the constriction and letting go, you know? And so I don't know if that just is an offering for really anyone listening.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that come up. One is, that's fucking incredible. Congratulations on getting to the point where you can intuitively interpret most of your dreams. I'm at that point too, where I can wake up and I'm like, fuck, I know what that means. You know? And it's only every so often where I have a complex enough one where I have to write it out. But it's one of those things that's at the point that where if I write it out, I'm like, oh, fuck, I know what that means.
Yeah, it deepens it.
100%. And so there's a couple of things that I want to touch on. One is, one of the gifts of being traumatized is that the psychic force inside of you gets stronger because it has to deal with larger obstacles. And then one of the byproducts of that tends to be very vivid dreams. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts that you can, it's one of the greatest superpowers that you could possibly incur, is to have vivid dreams. So congratulations there. The other one is, like, for me, I think most men are more disconnected from their emotions than women on average. And the practice that first helped me connect to myself was journaling. Because I'm highly linguistic and I'm very with the symbols, it was actually journaling that gave me the first bridge to really connect to myself, that then unlocked dreams for me. And like, so for some people, like, if you're highly, like, if your art is to do things with your body, maybe your way of connecting with yourself would be like yoga.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's running, maybe it's dancing, maybe it's writing, maybe it's dream interpretation. But I completely agree. Start with where you are called, that allows you to begin to build that bridge with yourself. Because fundamentally, it comes down to, can you be completely honest with yourself? And if that's through movement or writing or confronting your dreams, like, that's where it starts. And once you're honest with yourself, it gives you the option to begin to be honest with other people. And fundamentally, what seems to be one of the most healing things that you could possibly do in this world is to cultivate truth. And that starts with yourself. And then you learn how to be vulnerable and honest and authentic with the closest people around you. And as soon as you find that one person outside of you that you can be fully in truth with, something in us, like, unlocks and relaxes. Like, we are social animals. We have not evolved to be alone. And the really interesting research on loneliness is that the felt sense of loneliness is not correlated at all with the amount of people in your life. It is correlated with how many people you genuinely feel seen by. And so you could be in a crowd of people every day and still feel the felt sense of loneliness. But what allows you to feel seen is if you're vulnerable. You are responsible for whether or not you have the opportunity to be seen. It doesn't mean that you will be seen by the people around you, but the first step to, quote unquote, curing loneliness, which, by the way, people who report feeling lonely are more likely to die early than people who are obese, people who are alcoholics, people who smoke a pack a day, or people who live in an area with heavy air pollution. Like, it's because we are not meant to be isolated individual things. We are meant to be in community. But the thing that allows for loneliness to be alchemized is to feel seen. And to do that, you have to learn how to see yourself. And I think that that's why the journaling or the dream interpretation is such a powerful invitation. And then it gives you the opportunity to actually show your true self to people around you.
Yes. Is there also something about, like, writing it with your hand that is effective? Or because what is it about that compared to, like, speaking it? What is it about writing it?
So this is an interesting thing. When writing was first introduced into ancient Greece, Socrates actually lamented that it would make people dumber. And, because it's the same idea with, like, Google now, that we're outsourcing a part of our cognition and we won't have to remember it, blah, blah, blah. But the thing about writing is that it engages more than one sense. So, like, if you're thinking, it's just happening in your head. But if you write it, you're actually integrating it into your body. I think speaking is an even higher way of integrating, because when you speak, you're not only thinking, but you're also creating a vibration in your body. And so you're also integrating sound. And when you speak to someone else, you're also integrating sight, because they're being an active reflection in the moment. And I think, first, like, if you're new to this, the place to start is, can you admit true things that are scary simply in your mind? And then the step after that would be, can you write it? Like, can you see it on paper? Like, it's now slightly more made manifest in the world. But the ultimate like step of articulating your truth is to speak it. And what's interesting is you can begin speaking your truth alone, and your body will give you feedback. Like, one of the most powerful things about MDMA is that it's almost impossible, if you're alone, to say something out loud that's not true and feel okay. Like, at least for me, the like felt sense of tuning in my body, I can be alone on MDMA and do this type of work and say something out loud and instantly know whether or not it's true. And then to be received by somebody else from speaking your truth is like the fourth level. They've done studies, and you could critique the scientific method for maybe not understanding this, but they have found that there is not a difference between typing and writing with your hand when it comes to healing trauma. So that's just an interesting side note to like plant. But did that answer your question, Jade?
Yeah, no, that did. I just didn't know if there was something about it specifically like but that makes
I wanted to also
sense.
just, because and we're kind of like going back and forth, I guess, here on all these topics, but they all play together. When we talked about figuring out a way to tap in with yourself, and journaling is such a big piece of that, whether it's dream journaling or just, what is it called? Train of thought journaling. I don't know the you know
Stream
what I'm
of
talking about.
consciousness.
Stream of consciousness. Thank you. I know you guys know this. But then when you talk about having community and having a person, that one person, even if it just starts with that you can finally relay this information to and get it outside of you, so that you have a kind of a sounding board, a reflecting board of someone who's not going to hold, judgment over you. I mean, I guess we're all judging to some degree, but who's not going to shame you in any regard. Don't be afraid to pay for it, like a therapist, or or come to Jade or my OnlyFans and DM with us. I mean, we do that literally all the time for people, not just men. Women are over there. We're talking to people, holding space for their darkest secrets and their deepest truths, because that's what we want to do, like that's what it's for. So don't be afraid. I'm saying don't be afraid to pay for it, because for me, that has been one of the most powerful ways that I find I show up. I paid a therapist for every single week to be accountable to, so that I would show up for the work. And she was a beautiful mirror for me, So find whoever that person is. It doesn't have to be someone who just pops into your life, because then you get back into that cycle of loneliness and you're literally repelling people because you think no one's ever going to pop into your life who can hold that space for you. You can bring them in by paying for it. I mean, that's a beautiful relationship.
I completely agree. And to reinforce that, there's a couple of reasons why that is sometimes the best option. One is you might simply not have someone who has enough emotional intelligence in your life to hold the space for the shit that is true for you. And it would be the best option to get someone who is a professional. But also, and I'm sure that a lot of the people who listen to this podcast, and you guys are going to resonate with this too, but there's lots of people who identify as helpers or healers who aren't ready and who want your truth. They want to hold space for you, but then you can see how their behavior will unfold later, where it's like, oh, you weren't able to hold that. And also, even if you're around competent people, maybe the truth is about them, and that you need to get someone outside of your tribe to fully release what the truth is without dealing with the implications, the repercussions, and then you develop that safety, and then you're able to bring these hard truths to people who are close to you. So I completely agree. One of the greatest options is to find someone that you resonate with and then to pay for it.
Yeah. When we talk about that, can we also, because I think this could be common. I don't know if it's only common when people are doing MDMA assisted therapy, but can we talk about like transference and how for some people, while healing, it can be very confusing for someone to feel safe with someone of the opposite sex while they help them work through sexual trauma or any type of trauma from someone else of the opposite sex that wasn't making them feel safe, and what they can do with what comes up around that. You mentioned when I brought this up to you that it is pretty common, but I don't know that many people have heard of it. I hadn't.
Right. Yeah. So this is a great question. Okay. So fundamentally, your core relationship to your soul, or to that inner voice inside of you that everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say it, its first molding will happen with your caretaker of the opposite gender most of the time. And if that relationship is not held by a conscious, beautiful king or queen, which most of us weren't fortunate enough to have that, your connection to your soul will be warped by your relationship to the primary caretaker of the opposite gender. And then every relationship that you get in, like romantic relationship, when you fall in love, it allows for that warping to either correct or to twist further. And when you go get a therapist, if they are of the opposite gender, if you have the trust with them where they're able to really get and begin to heal that bridge between the ego and the soul, it can often feel like you are falling in love with them. And this was so common that Freud created a term for it, and it's called transference. And it's almost required for the healing to happen, because it's what allows that bridge to begin to be remolded. But if you're not aware of it, it will feel like you are falling in love with them. And then there's a thing called countertransference, where if the therapist is not trained enough, they will feel like they're falling in love too, because they're receiving the love beam from the other person. And it's really tricky, because it's almost required for the bridge to begin to heal itself. But the ultimate goal of the therapist is to reconnect. It's almost like you can imagine they're there to hold the projection of the loved one, to allow the bridge to self-correct. And then if they're really talented, it's to pass the bridge back off to the individual so they can connect it to their soul. And like the fundamental healing that happens is when the individual reconnects cleanly to that whisper inside of them. And then that's the ultimate psychotherapist that you will ever find, is that still inner whisper that will guide you through your intuition and your integrity in every situation.
This may sound silly, but does that mean that there is more healing takes place when you are speaking to someone of the opposite sex in therapy?
That's what I was going
Oh.
So any answer that I give is not backed by research here. It would just be me kind of going off of my intuition. But it depends where the most damage is. So the parent of the same gender will be your connection to how you show up in the world, which is what we would call the ego or the persona. And if both of those are broken, the one that needs to be, or that is most important for healing, would be the one with the opposite gender, because in a Jungian standpoint, that's how you relate to your inner guide, which he called the soul, but it's not the same way that most people currently use soul. If that one's not really warped, you can do a lot of healing if the damage came from, the caretaker of the same gender, because that will often represent how you show up in the world externally.
Mm-hmm.
And so both are important. The harder one to heal is the one with the opposite gender. But if that one's broken, that is the one that, if that's not fixed, it's like trying to build a house on a broken foundation.
Yeah. And I imagine not just on a healing level, but like within, but when you're with the same sex and it reprograms that story that you have, that you choose different types of girlfriends or different types of boyfriends of friendship. And then when it's of the opposite sex, that just that alone, that reprogramming of that story between that gender, not just with the inner healing, causes you to change how you choose your partners as well.
100%.
But I'm curious too, when people are, I know for me, the last couple of months through ketamine and MDMA therapy, I was having different visions of different sexual trauma. And like you said, it doesn't matter what was real or what was not. But the moment I started to have those, my body felt closed off to sex. And that, so for maybe 3-4 months, I haven't been sexually active because of everything that I've been processing. And so I'm curious how, when sexual trauma starts to come up and how when we start to work through it, how that affects our sex drive. And is that different for everybody, or does everybody's body kind of close off in that way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What I've understood so far is that it depends on how you've coped in the past, that you will activate whatever is the felt sense of safety. And for some people that's hyper.
Yeah.
Like,
and I was
that
a
would
very
be
prude teenager, so that makes sense.
right. And so because that was your default coping pattern to feel safe, that will likely be the way that it will manifest in you as you go through the healing, because your psyche is like, we have to protect. And yeah, so it depends on how you coped with it in the past will likely determine what comes up as you start to do this work.
Okay. Did you touch on all the ways to heal trauma that you wanted to touch on?
I touched on what is healing for PTSD. I'll move to like cognitive trauma or storytelling trauma, because it seems to be, of the three, that's the one that, easiest is not the right word, but it's the one that requires the least amount of technical interference or assistance. And what I have found for cognitive trauma is James Pennebaker's expressive writing technique, which is essentially, and I have a blog post on my website that people can check out if you just Google Erick Godsey expressive writing. But essentially what you do is you follow the protocol that he wrote out, and it's on the blog post. And for 4 days in a row, you set a timer for 20 minutes and you write stream of consciousness about the traumatic experience. And what intuitively happens is, as you rewrite that with the prompts that he gives for 4 days, by the end of the 4th day, the innate and healing intelligence inside of you will intuitively understand the story from different perspectives to a degree where you have a felt sense of understanding of, why did this happen? What was actually good about it? And how is my life better for it? Because when it comes to cognitive trauma, a part of what your psyche is doing is it's asking, or it's basically saying, something hurtful happened to us in the past, and the way that we responded to it wasn't adaptive. If it happened again, we have to come up with a new strategy. And you almost intuitively work through it by simply bringing your awareness to it every day for 4 days. And what is common is the act of doing it. You might feel sadder than you have for a long time while you're doing it, because you're essentially reopening the wound so you can fully clean it. But the act of reopening the wound can be painful. But what the research has shown, and it's fucking incredible, is for the next year, you will go to the doctor half as often. If you have any pain conditions, your felt sense of pain will be reduced. If you have chronic biological illnesses, their symptoms will reduce. If you have PTSD or depression, their symptoms will reduce. They've even found that you'll score higher on any type of cognitive test. You're more likely to get hired. I don't know how the fuck that plays out, but they've done that study. And it's because you're allowing your brain to put down something from the past that it thinks it has to think about all the time. And so that is the most effective technique I have found so far for healing cognitive trauma. Developmental trauma, if I'm just being honest, I haven't done enough research on that yet to feel comfortable giving like advice for what to do. But my understanding of it is to find a therapist who is trained in complex PTSD or developmental trauma, and then they'll work with you through the modalities that they've been trained in. Because the thing about developmental PTSD is it destroys our attachment bonds, and our attachment styles are how we bond with people. It's how we trust people. And most people who have a lot of developmental PTSD fundamentally don't even trust humans. And so the complex PTSD therapist has to really understand like the work that is before them. And so that is what I would offer there, is to find a trained therapist who specializes in complex PTSD.
The book Complex PTSD is also really helpful.
Yes, I haven't read it yet, but it's on my stack.
I've just started it, but it's already helpful. So,
and just listen back to Erick's podcast or read his blog on what is trauma. Is it called What is Trauma?
So good. Yeah.
It gives you all the book references in there as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to pivot us to keeping up with Erick Godsey. So the first time we had you on, you were at a place in your life where you're in open relationships. That was what was more appealing to you at the time. The second time we had you on, you told us that, you know, the growth you desired in open relationships, you discovered you could have in closed relationship. You're experimenting there. You've gone through some ups and downs. We're trying to just keep up with you, man. Where do you stand right now on all of it? What's your perspective at this point on relationships, closed, open, etc.?
Wow. A lot has happened this year. Hopefully we have 2 more hours. Okay.
We have 2 sub questions after this.
Perfect. So the big thing that happened about 2.5 years ago is I went to Peru and I did Wachuma and Vilca. And Wachuma is a type of San Pedro, and then Vilca is the most potent type of DMT that lasts for an hour. And it blew me open. And my big prayer when I was coming home was, I'm ready to do the work to remove the walls around my heart. And when I first came back with my mind, I was like, I'll do open relationship because that's the best way to break down the walls around my heart. And what I found for about 6 months is that I was saying yes to what I thought was scary, but I wasn't allowing myself to actually be vulnerable with any of these women because I was starting at open and it wasn't challenging me at all. And I did an MDMA ceremony alone, and I really realized, oh, you're fucking playing yourself. You aren't doing any of the work. And then organically in the next 3 days, all of the relationships that I was in organically ended themselves by the other partner's like choice. And I was like, all right, universe, heard. So I was single for a while, and then I got into a relationship, and this is the first like monogamous relationship I had gotten into since I had like really made the vow to, you know, open my heart. And we were together for a couple of months, and then she ended up cheating on me. And it was the first time that I'd ever been cheated on. And my big fear since I was a child was, what if they cheat on me? And so I had to confront that wall. And it was incredibly painful. It was the first time I had ever felt depressed in my life because this was the first relationship where I had started the story, oh, maybe this is the one, and we have babies and all that stuff. And the way that I alchemized that is basically whenever anyone asked me how I was doing, I told them the truth. And I just retold the story of what happened to the point where I didn't cry anymore. Like it took like 9 retellings of the story to people close to me where I was like, oh, okay. Like I almost intuitively did the expressive writing exercise verbally by telling the truth to my close friends. And then I ended up, this is going to be so funny once I get through the whole arc of what's been unfolding. But while we were together, we made the choice to go do ayahuasca together, like while we were dating. And then the fallout happened and we still chose like, let's go do ayahuasca together. And it was beautiful. Everyone who knew me was like, don't do that. That's not a good idea. You shouldn't bring that energy into the space. But what was interesting is nothing about her and our relationship came up in the ayahuasca space. But by the time that I finished the 4 nights of ayahuasca, I had this epiphany where I realized the larger purpose of me being called to this relationship was that it was my love for her that brought me to actually do ayahuasca. Because how I am when I'm single is it's all about the work. I'm sitting at my desk every day. I'm not fucking traveling. Like, no. It took her wanting to go to bring me out of my like work monk mode, and brought me to ayahuasca, which was the single most transformative experience of my life. And it felt like I fully energetically closed and understood why this relationship played out the way that it played out.
Mm-hmm.
I was single again for a while. And then probably 6 weeks after that, I entered into a relationship with someone that I had been best friends with for a couple of years. And I'd never done that before. And it has sparked a whole fucking thing that has unfolded for the last 11 months. And I want to protect her privacy, but also be in truth with you guys. The core of it was she had a lot of trauma that she had ran from through coping behaviors for a very long time. And by entering into a relationship with me, she was forced to confront these traumas. And the first couple of months of the year, her response was basically like, I know I'm in love with you, but I'm going to run away. And so there was this, I've never been anxiously attached. So of the 3 attachment styles, there's securely attached, there's anxious, and there's avoidant. Before I started doing the work, my attachment style was avoidant because I didn't want to hurt myself. So it's like, I don't care. Mm-hmm. And then, but whenever I enter into a relationship, my intuitive way of relating is to securely relate. This was the first time I ever felt what it felt like to feel anxious, because I could feel that she was in love with me, but I could see that her coping behaviors from her traumas were so powerful that she kept running. Mm-hmm. I eventually put that relationship down because I was like, this isn't going anywhere. And then I entered into a really beautiful relationship that was completely clean. But because of, in hindsight, I was still attached to that best friend. Mm. And the truth sharing with my partner at the time in the middle of the year eventually led to her being like, I'm out. Like, I love you, but you're not. And this isn't, so we're done. And then a bunch of really powerful personal things happened where I eventually entered into, a monogamous relationship with this woman for a couple of months. But I could just feel that like her coping avoidant behaviors were so strong that I could feel that she had never really fully shown up to the relationship. And then after like 2.5 months, she had the consciousness to be like, I can't hold this container anymore, so I'm going to step out. The way that she stepped out was in such a way where directly afterwards she was having sex with someone else. And, it felt like I got abandoned and got cheated on, but I didn't. And for like a week, I had to hold this feeling of like, my entire nervous system is responding as if the love of my life is having sex with someone else all the time. And it was completely destabilizing. Because we're best friends, we're still in each other's lives. And about 2 months after that, she finally got to the point where she felt safe enough to reveal that at the very beginning of the relationship, when we were monogamous, she had gotten drunk and cheated with her ex, and that she had been intertwined with her ex the entire year, but hadn't been upfront with me about it. And it just completely like broke the trust. Like I couldn't trust her at all. While we were dating, we made the plans to go do ayahuasca together. So we're still going to go motherfucking do ayahuasca together in a couple of weeks. And it is absolutely not lost on me that I'm clearly in a cycle that I have not healed. And just like 5 days ago, I had a really clear dream that was super fucking confronting. And the dream was I was in a store, it felt like Target. And I was in this aisle and there was this dude in like all black that felt super douchey. And he was bragging about how he only dates women who are traumatized because it makes them feel safe because he can see their entire trauma cycle. And I was like, this dude is a fucking dick. I was so repulsed by him. And then I go into the next aisle and do you guys know who Christine Hassler and Steph Stefanos are? Mm-mm. They're relationship coaches that I know, and they're married and they're super like, I respect them so much. They told me, you wait until you feel safe And then you escalate relationships quickly because you're afraid of rejection. And then I woke up and I was like, fuck, I know what this means. And I don't want this to be true. But clearly the first part of the dream was my shadow. And my psyche was showing me that my shadow is I'm attracted to women who are traumatized because it lets me feel safe. And then one of the symbols for the higher self are divine couples. And the fact that it was a couple and they're both relationship coaches, and they told me directly to my face, essentially why I feel safe with traumatized women is because it allows me to feel like I'm in control. And so my heart is being eviscerated because of this unconscious drive to choose women that make me feel safe. But then the tragicness of it is that the thing that feels safe leads to coping patterns that lead to me being cheated on. And my intuition is that as I go into ayahuasca, this is going to be something that's going to come up, and that it's not about the women. It's about my shit. And I'm going to go show up to that fully. And this is the first point in my life since doing Wachuma where I have no romantic relationship in my life. And there's this part of me that is just fucking exhausted with relationship right now. But I recognize that trying to date one of my best friends has eviscerated all the walls around my heart in the way that I thought open relationship would. And I can see the beauty in the like cliche, be careful what you wish for. Like I fucking wished for something powerful 2.5 years ago when my heart was wide open coming out of this medicine, and the universe was like, I got you. And it's been the most brutal, emotional, like heart year of my life. And I can feel that I'm like crawling to ayahuasca being like, fuck. So that's what's been unfolding for me. To answer the question about where do I stand on like open relationship and monogamy, is where I currently stand is that my intuition is that open relationship is a very powerful training ground, but that I truly believe every soul wants a sacred union. And a sacred union can have aspects of open to it, but I think everyone wants to be chosen. And so whoever is like the third in an open relationship, my intuition is that they're at the point in their life where they're learning, but that's not a stable configuration for them if they claim their full power of what it is that their soul wants. And I think everybody wants a sacred union. And a sacred union can have any type of rules that the two agree, but they each know you're my king, you're my queen. And there's no like trying to have two queens or trying to have two kings. I haven't seen it done by anyone that I know in person where it's stable. So open feels like a really powerful training ground, but that ultimately I think everyone, when they claim fully what they desire, and if they feel that they're worthy of claiming what they desire, it's to be in a sacred union. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. I guess the one caveat that I would offer is a lot of people think they're saying yes to a sacred union when they go into a monogamous relationship, but really what it is they're running and they're trying to find some place to hide, and then they go get fat and they stop pursuing their dreams, and they almost chain their partner to their I just want to be comfortable. So I don't think that monogamy is essentially a sacred union. I think a sacred union is this higher thing that's like a spiritual commitment. I will take responsibility for being whole, and I want to be whole with you, so we can make a third thing that's doper than what each of us can be individually, and that we serve the third thing. And that's kind of where I'm at.
I like it. It's fascinating that our evolution has not come to the point where we have to get there before we create the third thing. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of kids would have a lot less trauma we'd also have a lot less children generally if that was the case. Or maybe it would be the motivating factor for us to do our work, right? I mean, I don't know. I wanted to ask you specifically about the book We by Robert Johnson that I know you're a huge fan of, and the gold that it is brought into your life. So I haven't read it yet. It's on the top of my to read list. So maybe you can just give us some reasons why we need to dig in there.
Yeah. So the book We really touches on the thing that I was talking about earlier with transference. And We is probably the most important relationship book that I've ever read. And every time that I explain it to people, I see people's eyes light up because they're like, oh my God, that's me. I fucking totally get it. And the main idea is, so that book is written by a Jungian. And the argument that he makes is that one of our fundamental needs is to feel a connection to the divine. And religion 100 years ago or 200 or 300 years ago served as the symbol that could hold the projection of that need to connect to the divine, that we have to have something to project that onto to know it, and that the highest order is to finally reclaim it and know that that divinity is within us. When science came along and kind of destroyed the conventional container of religion, that didn't get rid of the need to have to project the divine onto something to understand it. It just had to find something new to project it onto. And the argument in We is that Western culture used romantic love as the new thing to project the inner divinity onto. Romantic love is unique to the West. It's not like in other cultures, there isn't this idea of like, if you fall in love with someone, you abandon your family if it's your true love, and you give up all your responsibilities, and you just go merge with this thing and just be drunk in love. And then if it's gone, you go to someone else because that's where the passionate love is. What Robert Johnson talks about in We is that if you don't understand that this is happening in your psyche, it's going to create a lot of destruction and pain. And it looks like this. You meet someone, you don't know anything about them, but you're like, oh my God, I am in love with them. You are projecting your inner ideal other that serves as a construct for the divine onto this person. Because one of the things to connect to is you've lived with you your entire life and you barely know who the fuck you are. So when you meet someone and you haven't even really spoken to them, but you feel this like, oh my God, you're projecting your God onto them. And one of the ways to understand this is it's almost like a person's body is like the frame of a 4K TV. And you can only project onto a certain type of frame because they fit like your idea of the inner other. But the vision that you see when you look at them is entirely your projection. You are illuminating all 4,000 pixels. He talks about it takes about 12 to 16 months to interact with that human enough where like 1/4 of the pixels are actually what they are as opposed to your projection. And what people will tend to do of their own conscious is as soon as they start to see the glimmer of the actual person behind their projection, they're like, I fell out of love, or you're not who I thought you were.
It's the wizard in Wizard of Oz.
Right.
He's not the magic curtain man.
And the thing that Robert Johnson talks about is that if you're unconscious of this process, you think you've fallen out of love. And so you unconsciously begin to look for a new TV frame to project your fantasy of the thing that you want to merge with, which is really your inner other. What he talks about is if you become conscious of this, you will actually recognize that after the 12 to 16 months, that is actually your first opportunity to actually love the person and to reclaim the projection and to put it where it's supposed to be, which is inside of you. But most people will run from relationship to relationship because they want to fuck themselves, because they want to fuck the inner projection of their ideal other. And that what he talks about is the way through this is to cultivate a felt connection to your soul and to recognize that your inner ideal other is your soul. And you can do that through ritual, meditation, plant medicines. He doesn't talk about plant medicines, but I'm going to put that in there. But anything that helps you connect to the divinity inside of you, and then to recognize at times my partner can consciously hold the projection and we can do freaky shit, you know, like that's fun, but that they are their own being, and that it's actually a disservice to them if you unconsciously are seeking them to be your God, because they can't hold that, and it denies them the opportunity of really being seen by you, and vice versa.
I love we. I just got she. Next I'll get he. But I'm curious, like, does that, when you're falling, because typically I feel like in the beginning is like the falling in love feelings and it's really fun and it's heated. Does that make that do you feel like now for you having that knowledge, you feel like I'm not really in love and like you're like, my mind's just tricking me?
That's a great
and
question.
then do you have to wait like 12 to 16 months to really know if you're in love with somebody?
Right.
And if you don't even like them anymore, then
all your alarms in your phone are going off.
Do you take that opportunity?
Right. No. So
do you take that
that's
opportunity at 12 to 16 months? Do you take that opportunity when you don't even seem to like that person to see if you can love that person? Or do you realize, oh, well, this whole time I've been projecting and there's nothing actually there?
So this is a great question, because I think that most people who hear this, that's one of the first things that they think. And the first thing that comes up is, if you're conscious of it, you can appreciate the beauty of what is happening. And like, this is an instinct. You can't stop this, but you can consciously, deeply enjoy it. That this human has come into my life. And if you believe in soul contracts, this human has chosen to be one of the frames of the projection of my God. And we both have a deep opportunity to explore divinity through each other and like enjoy that. But also recognize, like, maybe don't make life decisions in the first 6 months. Like, maybe deeply enjoy the motherfucking dance, drink it fully. Like, one of the ideas is that the gods envied humans because humans got to be in bodies. We get to taste coffee. We get to kiss. We get to know what orgasms are. We get to eat great food. We get to appreciate the wind coming through a tree and making that rustling sound. Like, we get to be in bodies, enjoy what the fuck is going on, but also understand, like, I don't know who they are. And get to know them. And then when you get to that point where you start to feel like, oh, they brush their teeth in a way that's kind of annoying, or like, I don't like the way that they make coffee. Like, you can recognize, okay, I am now at the opportunity that if I want to, I can get to really see them. And then you get to choose in that moment. But if for sure, like, don't overthink it. Don't have a motherfucking alarm clock in your calendar. Like, oh, it's December 20th. It's been 12 months. Like, you can appreciate that this is a beautiful part of the love dance that we have in our culture. And then also, you know, just have a quiet sobriety alongside the passionate drunkenness to recognize, like, I don't need to make any rash decisions about how I'm going to move forward in my life until I really get to know them. You know, it's the same idea that if you have a vision on MDMA, wait a week before you act on whatever your big insights are to like come back to a baseline. It's the same thing with ayahuasca or mushrooms or anything like that.
Or even a dream.
100%. Like, allow yourself to settle. And then like, there's really great writers and poets that like don't know they're talking about this stuff, but do talk about this stuff in a really clear and honest way, where like, there's that great line in Good Will Hunting where the Robin Williams character is talking to the main character, and he's like, I love the way that she farts. Like, all the little idiosyncratic things that are uniquely hers are the things that I love most. And to me, like, that's capital L love. But you can only get to that point after 6, 12, 18 months of just being drunk on God to recognize, like, oh, they take shits. They sometimes eat too many enchiladas and they burp, you know? And like, that's the opportunity to really start to appreciate like the meat suit that has willingly taken on your projection of God.
Yeah. Firstly, I just want to just express gratitude for knowing someone like you who's vulnerable enough and open enough to traverse all this with us and share your experience that openly. And I know last time we talked about this specific topic, you were going through a place that was about being blisteringly honest with your partner and how important that is. And I love this balance that it seems you've come to of yes. And, instead of scrambling for the truth, because I think that's what I feel like a pressure when you talk about, okay, well, you're going to have some time where you're not going to know this person's truth. You're not going to know the truth is what that sounds like to my psyche. And I'm like, wait, but I need to know, the truth. What am I wasting time for? And then we have this biological clock that's ticking, especially if you're females, all this stuff that starts populating.
Especially if you have kids.
Yeah. And that's my narrative trauma, I guess.
So the thing that I want to offer there quick is you can't project this inner ideal other on everybody. You can't even project it on most people. There's a certain type of person that will catch it. And you can, I have faith that if it gets caught on someone, it's meant to be caught here, and so it's not just this blind thing. There's an inner intelligence in you that's that TV is a TV to go sit
at. For sure. I think that's the beauty of it is that you've found a way to it is balance, balance the idea of, yes, we're here to look for the truth at the end of the day. That's what we're seeking. But it's also important to witness the truth that is being right now, in this moment. And it's the experience of this section of love that also looks like fucking yourself or being with God to that degree, or however you want to call it, which is beautiful. And it's an amazing part of life. And it's also the truth of why we're here, a big part of it. And then to witness it unfold into the next layer, right, of what the real person you're being with also is. So I just love the way that you're articulating it. We're getting to witness on this podcast, the progression. And I think it's so cool to see it unfold in each layer. We've been along with you on this ride, in more ways than one, if
I am going to do ayahuasca with someone who cheated on me next year, you guys need to fucking have an intervention with me.
Oh my God.
We'll bring this podcast and the last one up and be like, look, dude, this is a cycle. We need to talk about it. Again. On our annual talk. So
we have our short questions that we ask everybody.
We're going to wrap up the show here. I was going to say, we have so much more to discuss, and we know where to find you, but I would love to talk to you about,
he's going to change his number.
Yeah. Bye. But I know you've dived so deeply into things that I know our listeners deal with a lot, like depression and antidepressants, which is a huge, topic in itself. So I'll leave that for another time. But I want to also do
a whole 2 hours on that.
For sure. I want to invite people to go find you and your work as well on that specifically. And I know you're going to even unfold more of that in the years to come. So we'll be watching, we'll be sharing, I'm sure, with our listeners all about it. So for now, let's close out today's episode with the questions we ask you every year. So first off, if you could hug your younger self right now, Erick, what would you say?
It's going to hurt, but you're going to do it. And I'm proud of you.
How old were you this time?
5.
I love that. I would tell my 5-year-old self that. If you could have the whole world read one book, which would it be this year?
Probably Peter Levine's book on trauma. I think it's called Waking the Tiger.
Yeah, Waking the Tiger. That's really good.
If you could whisper one phrase to everyone on the planet, what would you say?
You chose to come here to fulfill a sacred task. You don't have to find it. You only have to remember it. And you have a still inner whisper that if you had the courage to hear it, is waiting for you, and it will guide you to your sacred task. And if you said yes to it, it would heal everything that you feel needs to be healed and would give you the most beautiful, fulfilling life that you could imagine.
That's beautiful. And if you
That's
say no to it, what's going to happen is that Dolores Cannon video I sent you earlier.
Yeah. Well, then the trauma begins again. I suppose the re-experiencing.
All right. Before we let you go, where can people find you online?
My website, erickgodsey.com. I have a weekly newsletter you can sign up for, and I have a journaling course that you can dive into. My podcast is The Myths That Make Us, and then my Instagram is Erick Godsey, but I won't be on that for a couple of weeks as I prepare to go be judged by ayahuasca.
All right.
Beautiful stuff, Erick. We always, as you know, appreciate your work and just you generally as a human for showing up for us in so many ways too, and supporting us, whether it be on your show or in person. And this has been a unexpected but beautiful relationship. So thank you.
Thank you too so much for seeing me and for being a part of this journey and for asking the good questions.
Yeah. Thank you.